I call them liminal dreams because liminal comes from the Latin limen, which is like a doorway or a threshold. And it's a place that's both and neither. Like a doorway is in both rooms and it's in neither room. So liminal is like both and neither. And it's that space where you're simultaneously awake and asleep.
I'm recording this time.
I'm excited to talk to you also.
Great. Well, welcome back to the Dream World podcast. So you wrote your book. I actually have it right here. It's called Liminal Dreaming. It's one of my favorite books that I've read on dream work.
So my name is Jennifer Dumpert. I am the author of Liminal Dreaming. I've been working in the field of dreams and the arena of dreams for a very long time. And I was doing lucid dreaming like a lot of people did and studied with Stephen LaBerge. And then I did a lot of dream-centric events. I did an event called the Oneirogen, which we can talk about a little bit. So I was doing a lot of different work with dreams. I actually had a kind of a watershed dream, which has often been what led me into my next phase of work. And it was a dream that I had in that in-between space. It was a dream I had while I was falling asleep. A few things happened. It was a very, very light dream. It was almost like it was overwritten on everything else. And I realized that I was actually still pretty awake, like I was still aware of where I was and in the bed. And, you know, my spouse is there. I can hear him breathing. And I was also having this dream. And I thought, I have these kinds of dreams a lot, these kinds of dreams where I'm kind of half awake and half asleep. And I don't know anything about them. I don't really know. I've never heard anybody sort of talking about them. And then I had the experience, which is something that used to happen to me when I was younger, of having my body fall asleep while my mind was still kind of awake. And I was like, okay, so what is this? So I really started looking into these particular kinds of dreams, which are so poorly studied, so poorly documented, and yet are one of the 8 EEG states that we all go through every 24 hours. Everybody goes through hypnagogia at least every 24 hours. So I just got really interested in these kinds of dreams.
Yeah, I feel like those are some dreams that a lot of people can relate to. Even people that don't dream tend to have weird hypnagogic phases. So why don't you tell me what that means? The word hypnagogia, a lot of people aren't familiar with, and hypnopompia, which is related as well.
Sure, and liminal for that matter. I call them liminal dreams because liminal comes from the Latin limen, which is like a doorway or a threshold. And it's a place that's both and neither. Like a doorway is in both rooms and it's in neither room. So liminal is like both and neither. And it's that space where you're simultaneously awake and asleep. So hypnagogia is the space between awake and asleep. As you're falling asleep, you go through hypnagogia. Hypnos is the Greek god of sleep. Agagos is going toward, it's from the Greek. So hypnagogia is going, it's a nice image, like you're moving toward the god of sleep. And hypnopompia is the opposite. Hypnopompia is what happens when you're going from asleep to awake. Hypnos again, and Pompe is going away from, like pomp and circumstance, when you're graduating. And again, everybody goes through this state every 24 hours. It's that state of mind that you go through when you're, for example, struggling to stay awake and you have that hallucinatory, often there's sound. It's like a kaleidoscopic association, like memory, image, things that are just kind of in your mind. And so if you've ever been, for example, struggling to stay awake, you're watching a movie or you're waiting for someone to come home, or it happens driving, I'm sorry to say, but it does. And you start to have that hallucinatory semi kind of dream state. That's hypnagogia. And you're right that people who often don't remember their dreams, if that's you, then hypnagogia is actually the state where people who have like short, fast circadian rhythms, people who don't remember dreams as a general rule, can work well with hypnagogia. So it's a really available dream state. But the thing about hypnagogia and hypnopompia is that in these states, you're both awake and asleep at the same time. So I can be lying on the bed and I'm hearing the clock strike 6, and I hear my neighbors yelling, whatever it is. Like I hear all of these things. And at the same time, I'm kind of having that light dream. So it's both awake and asleep, and neither awake nor asleep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm definitely a hypnopompia person. I have a lot of dreams in the morning, and that's my prime. But when it comes to the night, I do have some hypnagogic dreams, but I fall asleep very quickly. So what are
Yeah.
some ways that we can learn to like surf in this phase if we're not generally used to paying attention to this?
Working with hypnagogia is wonderful because it's so available to us. As I keep saying, every 24 hours we go through this EEG state. And I'm actually going to back up and talk about this a little bit. And then I'm going to give you some practices just because it helps people understand a little bit. So we all know EEG, right? It's when you're talking about brains, and I differentiate between brain and mind, just to be clear. So when we're talking about brains, we're often talking about like electricity and chemicals, right? Like how do you read what's happening in the brain? And we all know like an EEG reading, right? It goes, it kind of goes like this. And so every 24 hours, we all go through various EEG states. Like right now, we're engaged in a conversation. We're engaged is the word. So probably our brainwaves are in beta, something like 14 to 30 waves per second. In the deepest sleep, it's like 0.5 to 3. It's like the lowest waves per second. If you're super amped up and excited, you're kind of in gamma, which is like 40. So there are all these different brainwave states. And in a 24-hour cycle, we go through these different brainwave states, the ones that are awake and the ones that are asleep. And so hypnagogia and hypnopompia are two of these brainwave states. And they're pretty similar. Some people argue that they should be called just one thing. I actually, I strongly differentiate between them, but that's a whole other story. We're all having this experience, right? So everybody goes through it, everybody knows it. And one of the most common reactions I get when I'm talking about hypnagogia is people saying, oh, yeah, of course I know that. Like, I didn't know that was like a thing. I didn't know it had a name. And it does. So everybody does it naturally. Like something like lucid dreaming takes like a lot of work to learn how to do it, to get into it. But everybody is a natural liminal dreamer. So it's very easy to just drop into that. I'm going to talk about the EEG a little bit later, but I'm going to answer your question. It was a very long-winded way of getting to answering your question, which is like, how can we learn to go into these states? So because hypnagogia is a naturally occurring state, what you're really doing is you're just learning to recognize when you're in it, and then to learn to expand out the time that you spend there. There's a lot of easy ways to do this. For example, when you're sleepy in the afternoon, you can just lie down on the couch and start to go into nap space, and you can use like a voice activated recorder. So they're available as a phone app, easy, cheap, a few dollars to get a phone app. You can have the recorder near you, or pen and pencil. A lot of other exercises for like creativity, problem solving. You can get to that too. But when you're lying down and napping, try to pay attention to where your mind is going. And when you sort of start to go into that hallucinatory state, you can either start writing it down, or you can even just start mumbling into your voice activated recorder. To try to bring on the state, you can try napping in public is really good. Like if there's a park where you feel comfortable lying down on a blanket. If you're on a long car trip, climb into the back seat and try napping there. When you're going to sleep at night, you can try this exercise that I call the vanishing point. Really, what you're trying to do is track the moment that you fall asleep. And you actually can catch it. You really can catch that moment. It's very hard, but the practice of doing it will help you find that moment. So just as you're lying in bed try relaxing your body, like breathe slowly, deeply, relax your body, but kind of keep your mind awake. And if you feel yourself start to drift off, give yourself a little mental juice. If you're too amped up, breathe out, relax your body, right? Try to find that loop, like that feedback loop. And then you'll start to recognize where those spaces are. You'll start to recognize, like, oh, wait a minute, I'm having that hallucinatory state. I'm having that now. And again, I'm talking about hypnagogia specifically now, and not hypnopompia. Hypnagogia is a little easier to find, right? You'll start to recognize that you're in that state. It's really great to try this, like I say, in the afternoon when you naturally have an energy dip. Those EEG cycles are contingent on your circadian rhythm, and most of us have an energy drop in the afternoon. It's a really good time to try to catch hypnagogia. So really a lot of it is just becoming familiar with it. And honestly, just when you're going to sleep, like take a nap. Just take a nap and try to like catch that point. There's a lot of ways to sort of learn to locate it. It's really easy to find since we all naturally go through it. The trick is learning then to expand it out.
How can we understand our personal circadian rhythm better to help us with this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it's a great place to start understanding what I'm talking about when I'm talking about liminal dreaming. So circadian rhythm, it comes from the Latin circa, around, dien, day, so around a day. And in the 50s, Eugene Azarinsky, who's often called the godfather of sleep research, he's also the guy who figured out about REM and realized that we have a circadian rhythm. And again, this is just the 50s. So before the 1950s, Western science knew so little about sleep and dream. And it's still really, really poorly studied. And in fact, there are really only a couple books out there, including mine, about hypnagogia. So Eugene Azarinsky took some of his graduate students and they went into a cave, basically like deep into a place where there was no sunset, sunrise, just, dark, dark cave. And they measured when they slept, when they wanted to eat, when they, what their energy fluctuations were, et cetera. And they basically began to understand circadian rhythm. So circadian rhythm is what we have most in common with plants. Anything that is alive because of the sun, and that's most of the things on the earth. So there's the 24-hour cycle of the sun. Most of us don't actually have like a 24-hour energy cycle that matches that of the sun. Some people kind of do, but there are people who have like shorter, faster circadian rhythms. Those people are called larks. And here's how you know if you're a lark. If you wake up in the morning and as soon as you get up, bing, you're like wide awake. As soon as you open your eyes, you're wide awake. You jump up, you're ready to face the day. If when you start working, you're best when you're fresh. And as you're kind of starting to work, you lose steam a little bit. If you like go to bed early, you're like the first person who's ready to leave the party, then you're probably a lark. That probably means you have like a short, fast circadian rhythm. The opposite is an owl. If you're an owl, you probably have like a slow, long circadian rhythm. So here's how you know if you're an owl. If you wake up very slowly, you're pretty confused. In the morning, you're kind of stumbling around for a little while. You can work for really long stretches of time, and kind of the longer you work, the better you are. You're like the last person up at the party. You probably go to sleep late. Then that probably means you're an owl. And then there are the people who are kind of in between. About 40% of people are larks. About 30% of people are owls. And about 30% of people are in between, which is, by the way, why a lot of the world is set up for larks. And there's that whole early to bed, early to rise business, and, schools start really early, but actually now people are starting to catch up and realize that some people actually have different circadian rhythms. And so there are things like high school students starting later in the day to suit their circadian rhythm. But your circadian rhythm makes a huge difference in terms of how your dreaming is. So if you're a lark, if you have a short, fast circadian rhythm, you probably don't really remember your dreams as easily. Partly because you wake up so quickly, and you actually probably don't really experience much hypnopompia, that point when you're waking up in the morning. But hypnagogia is really the dream state for you. And when people actually come to me at my talks and workshops and say, I don't remember my dreams, what's wrong with me? What am I doing that I shouldn't be doing? I ask them these questions, and usually it's because they're a lark. And I'm like, it's genetic, right? Your circadian rhythm we inherit it. You can change it, as anyone who's ever worked the night shift or had children knows. And often people who are really doing a lot of dream work are owls, because all of the different kinds of dreaming are available to you. Hypnagogia, hypnopompia, you remember your REM dreams or whatever. But if you're a lark, then hypnagogia is actually really where you're going to be remembering your dreams. And it's probably that drifting off at night stage when you're going through hypnagogia that you have most of your dreams. But it's just those are so hard to remember because they're at the beginning of the night, kind of as you're going in. So understanding your circadian rhythm is really going to help you when it comes to determining what your dreaming is.
Yeah, makes sense. I definitely think I am a lark that has trained myself to have vivid dreams on both ends of sleep. It takes a lot of practice for me. That's really cool. So I have a question for you relating to these liminal dreams. A lot of people ask me about sleep paralysis. Would you consider this part of like a liminal experience? And is that more likely to happen if you're working with hypnagogia?
Yeah, so sleep paralysis is usually a liminal, not always, but usually a liminal dream phenomenon. A lot of some of what's happening is what's called REM breakthrough. So you're in, for example, a hypnagogic state, and then the REM kind of breaks through. Unlike hypnagogia, in REM dreams, your acetylcholine and a bunch of other chemicals work to paralyze you, right? So that you don't act out your dreams, right? So you paralyzed here, your limbs are paralyzed. Obviously some people sleepwalk and sleep talk, so the chemicals aren't quite doing their job. One of the ways that you experience sleep paralysis is that you're in a hypnagogic dream state, so you're both awake and asleep at the same time, and then you get a REM breakthrough, so you're paralyzed, and you're also having these sort of more intense kind of dream imagery. It can be very, very frightening. About 4% of the population regularly experiences sleep paralysis, but almost all of us go through it at some point or other in our lives. And for example, you have that, maybe it's a false awakening and you feel like you've woken up, or maybe it's just that you're trying to run, you can't move your limbs, you're trying to scream, you can't move anything. Often there's a frightening entity. There's some sort of scary figure who's there in the room with you. This is often, yes, a liminal dream experience. And so there's a lot of different ways to work with this. And it is, incidentally, all cultures have myths about sleep paralysis. So we have, for example, the succubus or the incubus. We also, maybe you've heard about the cat who's sitting on your chest and sucking out your life force, the old hag. But there's also, like in Hawaii, it's the night marchers. In a lot of Asian cultures, it's a ghost, an unpropitiated ghost who's coming back, who's trying to get you to pay attention. They're in Italian lore. There's this crazy little goblin. Most cultures have some sort of myth about the figure in sleep paralysis. If you are somebody who has this experience pretty often, I really recommend a book written by Ryan Hurd, Hurd, called Sleep Paralysis. And it talks a lot about the phenomenon and also talks a lot about exercises, that both ways to get yourself out of the sleep paralysis, but also quite interestingly, ways to get yourself into the sleep paralysis. And one of the things that it talks about is that curiosity is always going to be what trumps the fear, right? So if you become curious enough, then you sort of stop being afraid. So he's somebody who suffered from sleep paralysis. And for a long time, like, he came up with exercises to get out of it, whatever. And then at some point he was like, wait a minute. And he turned the tables and started trying to actually bring on sleep paralysis, because then he was kind of the one who was in control of the circumstance. And he got to a place, like, there had been this like big, scary, like monster that was always there in his sleep paralysis. And at one point, finally, he like marched up to it. He said, what do you want? Why are you always here? And the monster said, I've been trying to get your attention for years. There's a wise man who, wants to give you a teaching over here, who wants to talk to you. And it just completely changed the dream. So sleep paralysis is, like I said, something a lot of people experience. If you're somebody who has a lot of sleep paralysis, one of the ways to deal with it is just really regular sleep cycles, because it's when you're not getting good sleep and you're not getting REM sleep, and your REM is kind of like pushing in on you. That's kind of one of the times that you're going to have this experience of sleep paralysis.
I've had a lot of sleep paralysis, so I've become accustomed to it. And now I actually get excited for it because it leads to some really interesting experiences, like you said.
I'm going to show you this chart, and this is going to really help clarify a lot of what I'm talking about. And maybe I should have started with this, but this chart shows you the EEG states that are happening over the course of like a 7.5 hour night of sleep. Like I say, right now, you and I are engaged in this conversation. We're probably we're awake, obviously. We're probably in beta, so like 13 to 30 waves per second. And then over the course of a night of sleep, it kind of looks like this. So every 90 minutes, more or less, we wake up. It's true through the night. It's true of everybody. Most of the time, it happens so quickly that you don't necessarily notice it happening, but it still happens. So these orange lines here show the times of the night when we're waking up, and that's called a sleep cycle. That those points when you're waking up. So you're awake, and then you go through this first state of hypnagogia. And I'm going to talk about the EEG waves there in a second after I sort of go through this chart. And then you pass through that stage of hypnagogia, and then you go into theta. So theta is like 4.7 hertz, which is waves per second. Theta is where, as adults, most of our sleep is in theta. The older we get, the higher proportion of theta we have in our sleeps. Little babies in the womb, fetuses are in REM most of the time. Fetuses are cycling in and out of REM something like every 20 minutes. And then anybody who has had children and watched your baby closely knows that newborns up until like 6 months are also in REM a lot. You can see the little eyes moving underneath their eyelids. Scientists think that there is an association between REM and forming memory, which we can talk about a little bit when I talk about REM a little bit more. But theta is where most of our sleep is. And theta is also where really deep meditators go. So you go from awake through your first hypnagogia into theta, and then you go into delta, deep, deep sleep. And that's like 0.5 to 3 or 4, right? Without deep sleep, you die. Without REM, you go crazy. So you go through your first stage of deep sleep, a little bit more theta, your first stage of REM, and then you wake up again. And then that's your first sleep cycle. Your second sleep cycle, you go through hypnagogia again. You go back and forth kind of between theta and deep sleep, your next little bit of REM, and then you wake up again. So you need deep sleep to live. So that's one of the reasons that in this first like 3 hours, you know, and that might be like 3, 4, it varies a little bit, obviously. But in the first part of the night is when you get the deep sleep. And that's when people with insomnia often will wake up then. And that's when they have a hard time going back to sleep. Like this 3-hour awakening is where people with insomnia will, you know, often go. And then from there, you go a little bit through REM and then you wake up. And then for the rest of the time you're asleep, whether you're asleep for 7.5 hours or whether you're asleep for 10 hours, you're going back and forth between REM and theta. And the longer you sleep, the higher the proportion of REM is. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the REM is actually getting longer in proportion to the theta in every sleep cycle until eventually you go through hypnopompia and then you wake up. So this up here being like the line between awake and asleep, right? So this is kind of the course of a night. When I'm talking about the EEG states and, you know, what you're going every 24 hours, like every 24 hours, everybody is kind of going through that state. So, you know, from awake to asleep, once you're fully asleep, and from asleep to awake, you know, once you're sort of fully awake. So I mean, talking about REM and talking about these periods, I think it's really useful to see those cycles and see, you know, what's what.
I wanted to ask you about some of your personal experiences because I read in your book that, you know, you trained yourself to have really interesting hypnagogic dreams and kind of been able to even communicate across the border of consciousness, which I find so fascinating, you know, when you're half awake, half asleep. Are there any like really cool dreams that you like to share that you can think of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As I say, there is the state, you know, you're both awake and you're asleep at the same time. And it makes for some really extraordinary experiences. I can actually read you some of these sections of dreams. So, you know, as a practice, I've really learned how to go into these dream states. There's a lot of very weird stuff there. And there's a lot of reasons to be working with liminal dreaming. Creativity, problem solving, mental and physical healing. There's a lot that you can do with liminal dreaming. You can talk about what some of those exercises and practices are. But for me, a lot of what I'm really doing is I'm going into consciousness exploration, right? I'm really trying to figure out like what's kind of happening in my mind. I discovered, and this actually isn't in the book, this is something that as I have continued working with liminal dreaming as a practice, I've discovered that there are kind of like different phases of hypnagogia where you're both like awake and asleep, but in varying degrees of awake and asleep. One of the only other books that's really specifically about these states is a book called Hypnagogia by Andreas Mavromatos, and it's written in 1984, I think, maybe 83. And he talks about the 4 stages of hypnagogia, the lightest state to like the deepest state. And his states, they're very specific, you know, where there's like one of them is nature scenes, like at the lightest stage is like faces turning toward you, which actually does happen to me. And I actually had a friend whose kid was afraid as he was falling asleep of the faces that would turn toward him, you know, as he was kind of going in and falling asleep. And so he would try to, you know, go to sleep with his son. And then he said it started happening to him a lot. But over time, I have discovered these kind of 4 stages of hypnagogia. I first sort of discovered it I was at a production of Carmen, the opera, with my in-laws. And it was not a particularly good production of Carmen. So I kind of wanted to pay attention to it, but I also, was kind of ignoring it. And so I was going in hypnagogia. And so I would close my eyes and I would go into a hypnagogic state, drifting in the hypnagogic state. But I was tracking the music because, again, awake and asleep at the same time. And in an opera, they often have like the super titles so that you can read what's happening, like it's all the words. So I would go and I would listen to the music, and every time the music changed, I knew that something had changed in the story. So I would open my eyes and I would read the super title, and then I would go back and hypnagogia. So I was staying very awake, but still going into hypnagogia. And I'm going to call this like the lightest stage of hypnagogia, where maybe 80% awake and 20% asleep, because you can be all sort of different percentages of awake and asleep. So this is still a little bit asleep, but sort of mostly awake. And in this stage of hypnagogia, I discovered that it really unlocks memory, like childhood memory. And in this experience, at Carmen, I had this really vivid memory of the public swimming pool where my sister and I used to go swimming when we were kids, and like her yellow bathing suit and the smell of the chlorine and the sound of my feet slapping on the wet concrete and like just the gray lockers. I just had this incredibly vivid memory of like what had happened in my childhood. So that's one stage that you can go into. And if you're interested in experimenting with this stage, listening to music is a great way to do it. So listen to a piece of music that you're maybe trying to pay attention to the words or pay attention to the music, but like try to drift off into light sleep. And I've discovered that it is really amazing for unlocking like childhood memory and really vivid sensory memory, like taste and smell and sounds. The next sort of level down, where I'm going to say maybe you're like 60% asleep and 40% awake. I first started noticing this one in my one time in my room, like just like when I was whatever, playing with hypnagogia, and I'm like lying on my bed, and I'm kind of aware of what's going on. I'm a little bit awake, and there's a lot of wordplay involved in this stage of hypnagogia. So again, you can hear the neighbors. And so I have developed this partly through like an automatic writing practice. And like automatic writing is a very old practice. Like, John Dee channeled the angels. John Dee was like Queen Elizabeth in the 1600s, right? Queen Elizabeth I's wizard, and like the classic wizard with the big hat and the stars on it and whatever is kind of based on John Dee. And John Dee would kind of go into hypnagogia and get in touch with these angels and write things down. Or the Dadaists had a practice of automatic writing where they would go into hypnagogia and they would just like asleep with a pen and paper. I can touch type. And so I learned to sit back with my computer in my lap, with my laptop in my lap, just typing in hypnagogia. So I'm in hypnagogia and I'm kind of just touch typing what's happening. And so it's very language and wordplay. And I'm actually going to read you one of those dreams.
Awesome.
Speared asparagus, cooking class. 2 Christmas tree angels hold hands, mostly awake, but the dream gets deeper in the mouths of the little sea creatures wiggling at the bottom of my field of perception, though there's no edge. Greet and pink, a set of cat ears in the very far distance. My upstairs neighbors yelling, maybe a sporting event. The sound ricochets. The word ricochet. How do I spell that? Seems like it has a CH, but not. Crazen hussy, crazier. A pulsating light off to the right. So that was kind of like automatic writing and going into the hypnagogia that way. And then going like deeper in, you start to get to the stages where you're actually more asleep than awake. So I was talking earlier about the practices of using voice activated recorder. So that's one of the ways that I had gotten into those states where I'm actually more asleep than awake. And those are very image heavy. I actually have one in the book, but where it's a lot of like Persian rug, mandala images, kaleidoscopic, swirling, changing, like the color purple coming back and forth, clouds moving, very visual. Sometimes for some people, very aural. Like my spouse tunes into an alien radio station. Sometimes I hear crowds running down the street outside of my apartment. So that actually starts to get very visual. At the final state of hypnagogia, which is the deepest state where you start to get a little bit more in the way of storyline, that's that vanishing point. So you're actually starting to get maybe something that's a little bit more like a normal dream, something that's a little bit more like it's a narrative happening. And to get that's where you try to like hold on to the moment that you're falling asleep.
I can see how that's such an area for like creative inspiration. Like the dream you shared just sounds like such a vivid, like so visual and so vivid. That's really cool. When you notice that moment that you fall asleep, just really quick, like what does that feel like? Do you just notice because you're aware and then all of a sudden you're not? And then when you wake up, you're like, oh, I remember that last moment of awareness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's a great question. And it's really hard to describe. And it's a very weird circumstance. So basically, and honestly, this used to happen to me when I was young and taking a lot of LSD. And I would have this experience. And now, later in life, I realize that I actually have it in hypnagogia as well. And it's the feeling of falling asleep. So for example, I will hear my breathing start to get slower. I'll feel my limbs start to get heavier. And then I'll get to the place where I'll realize that my body has fallen asleep and I can feel that full physical relaxation of being asleep. And my mind is still there, but it's just kind of holding on. And often that's where there's like more of a narrative kind of dream. So I can feel the deepest, like, 80% asleep. Those narrative dreams are happening and I can feel my consciousness starting to slip away. And you're right. And then it's just, I wake up and, maybe I have the memory of that having happened, or maybe I don't. One of the things that distinguishes liminal dreams from REM dreams is that liminal dreams, for the most part, except for the deepest ones, they don't actually tend to be narrative in the same kind of way. So REM dreams are a lot like being awake, but weirder, right? So I'm on Mars, and there's a big iron spaceship that flies around the universe collecting samples, and me and my squirrel family are throwing rocks at it. Whatever it is, right? I'm me. I'm in the world. There's a thing happening. I'm interacting with the world. Whatever. Like it's kind of a narrative thing. I mean, it's weird, but usually at the time, unless you're in kind of a liminal dream state, usually at the time, it's quite credible. You're like, okay, yeah, I'm in the world, the thing is happening. In liminal dreams, it doesn't tend to be usually quite that way. There's often not a self and another. There's not like a narrative arc. It's much more like just the moment that's unfolding. So maybe it is one of those Persian rug mandala imagistic unfolding, fast moving, but it's not like it's me in the world interacting with other characters. It's a very, very different kind of experience. It's actually, in a lot of ways, I find it like weirder even than like REM dreams, just because it is such a different thing. It's just kind of the moment that's happening.
Yeah, they're definitely more chaotic. I've experienced that. And, I could totally understand how, like, you mentioned how this has been a practice, in different ways for such a long time. Like the legendary painter Salvador Dali, how he used to use his liminal dreams and hypnagogia to create his incredible paintings. So that's something really cool you mentioned. Could you talk briefly about how you can like use all this crazy hypnagogic content and turn it into something creative?
Sure, yeah, and that's and you're right, Salvador Dali, and actually Salvador Dali and Thomas Edison, independently of each other, came up with the same exercise for channeling hypnagogia for creativity, which is now something that MIT with a tool called Dormio is trying to imitate, but it's very easy to do for anybody at home, and so. Salvador Dali and Thomas Edison came up with this exercise independently of each other. So I call it the Dali-Edison exercise. And basically, Dali used this to inspire him. A lot of the ideas for his art came out of hypnagogia. Edison used it to come up with ideas for inventions. And so what they would do is each man, when feeling tired, often in the late afternoon, would sit back in like a deep, comfy, easy chair, and Edison put 2 metal plates on the ground. Dali put 1. Edison would hold a ball in each hand, and Dali would hold, he was very specific, a big brass Spanish key. Edison kept pencil and paper next to him, and Dali kept his sketch pad. And they would sit back in the comfy chair and go into a hypnagogic state. And then as soon as they started to pass from hypnagogia into sleep, so if you remember that chart, there's like you've got that little space of hypnagogia, and then you're actually falling asleep. As soon as they would actually fall asleep, they would naturally let go of what they were holding, the balls or the key, and those would clatter and hit the metal plates. And then Edison would immediately start writing down ideas, and Dali would immediately start sketching. And so, I think one of the reasons that hypnagogia is really good for creativity is because you're still thinking, right? Your mind is always going. And but when you're in hypnagogia, your mind is going, like different things are happening. And a lot of your waking ego, like the stuff that plans, oh yeah, I have to get this done, I have to call my mother, or I'm writing this paper, or whatever, gets sort of turned off. So you're thinking about things in a really different kind of way. So it's really great for creativity and problem solving. And so you can try this exercise at home. And you can I often use a handful of change. Just sit back like in a comfy chair with a handful of change, a jingly dog toy, whatever it is. Like sit back in your easy chair or whatever, holding on to whatever it is. And you can keep pen or pencil next to you. You can also keep, again, voice activated recorder. I make a lot of use of voice activated recorder. Keep whatever it is near you. And then as soon as you start to fall asleep, you'll drop the handful of change. So just now when I was talking about the 4 stages of hypnagogia, which is when I'm giving like talks or workshops, I often talk about that. And actually that part of a talk I wrote in hypnagogia using this method. And like the benzene ring was conceived in a hypnagogic dream. Louis Agassiz figured out how to chip away stone to find fossil in a hypnagogic dream. The periodic table was conceived in a hypnagogic dream. In all these cases, it was a problem that somebody had been working on and trying to solve and had in their head. And then in the hypnagogic dream, sort of a different way of thinking about it would kind of jar something loose, and the idea would come to the fore. So it's great for coming up with ideas. It's great for problem solving, especially if you've already got what the idea is in your mind.
Yeah, that's actually happened to me. I'll always get good ideas as I'm falling asleep, and sometimes I wake up to write them down so I don't forget them. So I kind of wanted to circle around to something you mentioned in the beginning. You mentioned that in your early research, you attended this Oneirogen event. I would love to know what that is.
I actually started it, and I still do them occasionally. But for a long time, I did them every month. And the Oneirogen, it has a terrible name, and the reason it has a terrible name was it was just a thing that I came up with for my friends. And then it was online, and there used to be, at the early days of the web, there used to be something called Stumble Upon, where they would find cool things on the web, and Stumble Upon found my weird little website, and it ended up at the height of it, there were, a few thousand people from all over the world who would do this event. And basically, we would do this once a month, and people from around the world, we would decide what the Oneirogen was going to be. And an Oneirogen is anything that promotes vivid dreaming. Oneiro is dream, and gen is to create, like generate, right? From the Greek. And so an Oneirogen is anything that creates vivid dreams, a root, an herb, a scent, a sound, a practice, whatever it is. And so on the same night, there'd be a group of us who would sleep in the same space to kind of hold down the fort. And then people from around the world, we would all use the same Oneirogen. So something like Calia Zacatachichi, which is an herb used by the people of northern Guatemala, sort of southern Mexico, or Selene capensis, which is used by the Hausa people of South Africa. Or there are a lot of wonderful indigenous Oneirogens, but there are also a lot of modern things too. Things like binaural beats or whatever. So people from around the world would all on the same night use the same Oneirogen. And we would all so basically it turned into like a worldwide slumber party where we were basically just experimenting with what were the effects that different Oneirogens had on our dreams. And if you go to Liminal Dreaming, all my websites are kind of like put together like a house with a lot of bad additions on it, just because they're all here and there. But if you go to liminaldreaming.com, you can find the Oneironauticum site. And there's a little database there that talks about like the 12 Oneirogens with which we experimented most often and the different kinds of effects that they have.
Yeah, that's really incredible. I love experimenting with Oneirogens. You actually brought up a question for me that I did want to ask you. When you mentioned binaural beats, when you were talking about the different brainwave states, I know that binaural beats can train you to enter a certain brainwave state, such as like theta or something like that. So does that affect your hypnagogic stage? Does it make it more like vivid, or what does that do for the hypnagogic state?
Yeah, so great. That's a good question. It actually reminds me of something that I really wanted to talk about, which is EEG. All of these different states have like a specific sine wave. Again, we talked about earlier, when you're talking about brain, you're usually talking about electricity and chemicals, right? And most of us know that can recognize a sine wave, right? So you can see that like this deep sleep is, the low sine wave like that, right? One of the interesting things about REM is it actually has the same EEG signature as beta, as being awake. You can't just tell from an EEG whether somebody is having a REM dream or not, because your brainwaves are doing the same thing. But it still has a distinctive brainwave. Theta has two different brainwaves, so it's unusual. But hypnagogia and hypnopompia actually have 6. So hypnagogia and hypnopompia are by far the shortest EEG states that we go through without training yourself to spend longer in them. And you can train yourself to spend hours in them, as I do. You're often in them maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. It's by far the shortest EEG state that we go through every 24 hours. But it's also the most chaotic. It actually has 6 brainwave signatures in it. So it's very, very, very chaotic. And when your arm jerks or your leg jerks, that's how you know you're going into hypnagogia. And your body is kind of doing the same thing as your mind, right? It's kind of going into this chaotic mode. You talked earlier about surfing, and there's a model I really like is if you think about pretty common images for the conscious mind is like land as conscious mind and ocean is like unconscious mind. And where the ocean meets the land is where it's really chaotic. It's where there's all the waves, and that's where you surf. So I really like to think about liminal dream work as kind of surfing consciousness. So the way that binaural beats work is that if you have a frequency in one ear and a different frequency in the other ear, your brain will try to bring them together in one particular brainwave state, right? So let's say, for example, you wanted to get more deep sleep. Let's say that you're using binaural beats because you don't think you're getting enough deep sleep. Then you could put like a frequency of 100 hertz in one ear, and then you could put a frequency of like 101 hertz and the other ear, and then so you've got the two different frequencies coming in, and your brain will try to find the difference, right? So that like that one, one brainwave per second, that 1 hertz, which is deep sleep, your brain will try to go there. So the way that binaural beats work is that they're trying to get your brain waves to regulate at a particular frequency. And so binaural beats can be really useful for things where it's pretty clear that the brainwave is is making a big difference. So if you're trying to work specifically with REM dreams at night, if you're trying to work with deep sleep, even if you're trying to work with hypnagogia, because the binaural beats will just keep changing what the frequency is to keep it at like a kind of a chaotic state. So binaural beats work well for those kinds of things. The things that binaural beats don't necessarily work as well for, and you'll often see them advertised, like they'll say, oh, this one is the orgasm binaural beat, or this one is this one is the LSD binaural beat, or whatever it is. Like those things, I'm not quite as much because it's actually not how the binaural beats work. The binaural beats are very much about what the EEG signature is.
Yeah, it makes sense. People just do things for clickbait, but it's good to understand like what it does.
I just want to jump in a little bit and give a little bit of a moment to hypnopompia. We've been talking a lot about hypnagogia, and hypnagogia is, again, it's a very easy dream state to work with because we all go through it, naturally. It happens to all of us. Hypnopompia tends to be a little bit more the realm of owls or people who are sleeping in, but it's an amazing mind state as well. And if you're interested in trying to work with hypnopompia, the thing to do is set aside a morning when you can really sleep in. Try to eject anybody else who sleeps with you, be it a human friend or an animal friend, from the room. Try to sleep alone for the night. Go to sleep, wake up in the morning, and try to wake up as slowly as possible. Wake up, as soon as you start to drift awake, try to be aware of breathing out, letting your energy, go out from the body and go back into the sleep state. Hypnopompia is actually my favorite mind state. I love hypnopompia. It's wonderful and delicious. It's also a great way to both remember dreams, if you're trying to work with remembering REM dreams, and also there are a lot of lucid dream practices that work with hypnagogia and hypnopompia. You probably sleep most of the time in one of 3 or 4 different postures. I tend to sleep on my side curled with a fist on my forehead and a hand between my knees. If you're trying to work with remembering the dreams you've had at night, you're trying to work with lucid dreaming or just working with dreaming in general, a great practice is think about what physical positions in which you normally sleep, identify those. And then in the morning, when you're waking up, try to stay in hypnopompia. Do that slow wake up, and then try to move into one of your sleep positions. See what you can remember, and then try to switch to one of the other ones slowly and carefully. I also sleep on my back with my arms above my head. As anybody who has a physical practice, be it yoga or a sport or whatever, knows the body has memory, right? Your body will remember things that your mind doesn't necessarily. Like playing piano, you're learning to get your mind out of the way and actually just have it be the feedback loop between hands and music and whatever. So remembering dreams can be the same way. If you get your body into the same position and then try to sink back into the sleep stage with hypnopompia, you may find that that's a great way to remember dreams from the night.
Yeah, that's incredible advice, honestly. I'm so excited to share this with my listeners because, yeah, I talk a lot about lucid dreaming, but this is something that everybody can do every day. So I really appreciate that. You mentioned your website is liminaldreaming.com.
Urbandreamscape.com is also a great place to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. It was a pleasure just learning from you. Your books and, your talks have inspired me a lot. So I'm grateful for all that you do.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Hi, Pup.
She's
So
been here
cute. Oh, so cute. I wonder if she has cool dreams too.
I see her twitching in her little dream states.
Oh.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.